Cruelty in Oakhaven wore a tailored suit and a smug grin. When Mayor Archibald handed over his niece, a woman ridiculed for her sheer size, he expected the mountain man to break. He never anticipated the beast would find his queen, nor the empire they would forge from spite. Oakhaven, Colorado Territory, was a booming timber town in the fall of 1883, a place where fortunes were carved from the dense pine forests and lost just as quickly in the saloons. Jedediah Boone stood in the center of the mayor's opulent office, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow across the polished mahogany floorboards. He was a man of the high peaks, built like the granite mountains he called home, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a winter storm. He had come down from Pine Ridge for one reason: to settle the back taxes on his 300 acres of prime timberland. Behind the oversized desk sat Mayor Archibald Higgins, a man whose wealth was only matched by his profound malice. Archibald had been trying to get his hands on Pine Ridge for 5 years. The railroad was coming, and Jedediah's land was the only viable pass through the western ridge. "The total is $800, Boone," Archibald said, leaning back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Payable today, in gold or banknotes. I know for a fact you barely scraped together 100 from your winter trapping." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "The law allows for an extension in the case of a hard winter. I have 100 now, and I'll have the rest by the spring thaw." "The law allows what I say it allows," Archibald countered, a vicious smile playing on his lips. "I could foreclose right now. The sheriff is right outside that door. But I am a Christian man, Jedediah. I believe in charity. I will wipe your debt clean. All $800. I will even sign a permanent deed recognizing your absolute ownership of Pine Ridge, immune to future town taxes." Jedediah narrowed his eyes. "What's the price?" "A wedding," Archibald said smoothly. "You need a wife to legally claim the homestead exemption anyway, and I have a niece who has become a heavy burden on my household. Marry her, take her up to that God-forsaken cabin of yours, and the land is yours free and clear." Jedediah remained silent, processing the trap. Archibald Higgins did nothing out of the goodness of his heart. The heavy oak doors to the office slowly creaked open. Stepping into the room was Henrietta Caldwell. She was fat. There was no polite society euphemism that could mask it, and Henrietta herself had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. At 24 years old, she possessed a massive, soft frame that strained the seams of her dark woolen dress. Her waist was thick, her hips wide, and her face round and flushed from the simple exertion of climbing the courthouse stairs. In a harsh frontier town where women were expected to be slight, fragile things, Henrietta was an anomaly, a target of relentless, cruel whispers and open mockery. She kept her head bowed, her double chin pressing into her lace collar, fully expecting the towering mountain man to burst into laughter or storm out in disgust. Archibald's plan was brilliantly wicked. He knew Jedediah Boone was a solitary, hard-working man who survived on physical endurance. By chaining him to a remarkably fat, supposedly useless city spinster, Archibald assumed one of two things would happen. Either Jedediah would refuse the humiliating offer and forfeit the land today, or he would accept, take her to the mountains, and abandon her when the winter grew harsh. If Boone abandoned a wife, Archibald could legally seize the land as compensation for his wronged niece. "This is Henrietta," Archibald sneered, gesturing vaguely in her direction. "As you can see, she has a hearty appetite. I'm tired of feeding her. You want your mountain, Boone? You take my niece." Henrietta closed her eyes, hot tears prickling the corners. She dug her plump fingers into the folds of her dress. She was a bargaining chip, a joke, a punishment inflicted upon a stranger. She braced herself for the mountain man's rejection. Jedediah looked at Henrietta. He did not sneer. He did not laugh. His gaze slowly moved over her large, trembling form, noting the intelligent, terrified hazel eyes that darted up to meet his for a fraction of a second. He looked back at Archibald. "Draw up the papers," Jedediah rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "The marriage certificate and the permanent deed. I'll sign both." Archibald blinked, his smug smile faltering for a moment before returning with a vengeance. "Excellent! The Reverend is across the street. Let's get this over with." The wedding was a brief, humiliating affair. The townsfolk gathered on the boardwalks, snickering behind their hands as the giant mountain man and his massive bride stood before the preacher. Henrietta felt the suffocating weight of their stares. She felt grotesque, sweating in her heavy dress, her large chest heaving with anxiety. When it came time to exchange vows, Jedediah's voice was steady. He took her thick, soft hand in his heavily calloused one. His grip was surprisingly gentle. He did not squeeze in anger or pull away in disgust. "I, Jedediah, take you, Henrietta," he said, looking directly into her face, ignoring the giggling crowd. Within the hour, the paperwork was filed. Archibald handed over the deed, his eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. "Enjoy the winter, Boone. Try not to let her eat all your winter stores." Jedediah ignored him. He walked over to Henrietta's single, heavy traveling trunk resting in the dust. Henrietta moved to grab one of the leather handles, expecting to drag it to the wagon herself. Instead, Jedediah hoisted the immense trunk onto his shoulder with a single, fluid motion. "Wagons this way, Mrs. Boone," he said quietly. Henrietta's breath hitched. It was the first time anyone had addressed her with a title other than a whispered insult. She gathered her skirts and followed her new husband out of the town that had hated her, stepping into the terrifying unknown of the wild mountains. The trail up to Pine Ridge was not meant for wagons. It was an old logging road, steep, rutted, and treacherous. For the first 5 miles, the mules pulled the buckboard wagon steadily. Henrietta sat silently on the wooden bench, her large body absorbing every brutal jolt and bounce of the unpaved road. She was acutely aware of how much the wagon groaned under her weight, a fact that made her want to shrink into nothingness. Jedediah drove the team with silent expertise. He hadn't spoken a word since they left Oakhaven. Henrietta assumed he was seething with resentment. Why wouldn't he be? He had been forced to saddle himself with a fat, cumbersome woman just to keep his home. She stared at her lap, her mind racing. She knew she was not physically fit for homesteading. She lacked the stamina to hike, the agility to farm, and she suspected she would be a massive burden to this rugged man. Disaster struck halfway up the mountain. The wagon wheel caught a deep, rain-washed rut. With a loud, violent crack, the rear axle splintered. The wagon lurched dangerously to the side, nearly tossing Henrietta into the dirt. Jedediah leaped down, inspecting the damage. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Axles busted. Mules can't pull it like this." Henrietta felt a cold dread wash over her. What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Means we unhitch the mules, load what we can on their backs, and walk the rest of the way," Jedediah stated simply. "It's about 3 miles, straight up the incline." Henrietta's heart hammered against her ribs. 3 miles, uphill, in the thin, biting mountain air. For a woman of her immense size, it sounded like a death sentence. But she had a fierce, hidden pride. She refused to give Archibald the satisfaction of hearing she died weeping on the trail. "All right," Henrietta said, her voice barely a whisper. She awkwardly clambered down from the tilted wagon, her heavy boots hitting the rocky soil. They began the ascent. Within the first 10 minutes, Henrietta's lungs were burning. Her corset, already tight, felt like an iron cage constricting her chest. Sweat poured down her face, soaking the collar of her dress. Her thick thighs chafed painfully against each other beneath her heavy woolen skirts. Every step was an agonizing effort against gravity. She began to fall behind. She gasped for air, leaning heavily against a massive pine tree, her vision spotting with black dots. She expected Jedediah to yell at her, to call her a useless cow, to tell her to hurry up. That was what Archibald would have done. Instead, the crunch of boots on gravel stopped. Jedediah turned around. He looked at her flushed, sweating face, her heaving chest and her trembling legs. He walked back down the trail toward her. Henrietta flinched, preparing for a blow or a cruel word. Jedediah reached to his hip and unhooked his leather water canteen. He uncorked it and handed it to her. "Pace yourself," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Mountain doesn't care how fast you go, long as you don't stop. Drink." Henrietta took the canteen with shaking hands and drank deeply, the cold water soothing her parched throat. She looked up at him, bewildered. I am slowing you down. You must be furious." Jedediah looked out over the valley below, then back at her. "I knew what I was getting when I signed the paper. You didn't ask for this any more than I did. Take your time, Etta." He called her Etta. Not Henrietta, not an insult. Etta. For the next 3 hours, they climbed. Whenever Etta needed to stop, Jedediah stopped. He didn't sigh, he didn't tap his foot. He simply stood guard, letting her catch her breath. By the time they reached the clearing where his cabin sat, the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long purple shadows over the snow-capped mountains. Etta collapsed onto a tree stump in the yard, her entire massive body aching and trembling. She had done it. She had survived the climb. The cabin was a sturdy, rough-hewn structure. Inside, it was the domain of a bachelor who only saw it as a place to sleep. It was dusty, disorganized, and smelled intensely of tanned hides and wood smoke. Traps were piled in corners, and the pantry shelves were a chaotic mess of half-empty sacks of flour, hardtack, and dried jerky. Etta pushed herself up from the stump and walked inside. She looked around the chaotic room. Archibald thought she was useless because she couldn't run a foot race or fit into high society gowns. But Archibald didn't know that she had spent the last 10 years hiding in his library, reading every book on agriculture, accounting, and domestic management she could get her hands on. She knew how to stretch a pound of flour, how to mend heavy canvas, and how to balance a ledger better than any bank clerk in Oakhaven. "I will prepare supper," Etta announced, her voice surprisingly steady. Jedediah looked at her, then at his messy hearth. "You don't have to tonight. You're exhausted." "I will prepare supper, Mr. Boone," she repeated firmly. She needed to prove her worth. Using her broad shoulders and sheer weight, she easily shifted a heavy iron cast stove into a better position, something that would have taken a smaller woman, a lever, and an hour to accomplish. She sifted through his disorganized supplies, found salt pork, dried beans, and a hidden stash of wild onions. 2 hours later, Jedediah sat at his rough-hewn table, eating the best meal he had tasted in a decade. The beans were rich and flavorful, the pork perfectly rendered. Etta sat across from him, eating a modest portion, her eyes downcast. The next morning, Etta woke up entirely sore, but she forced herself out of bed. While Jedediah was out chopping wood, she went to work. She scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom. She organized his pantry, calculating exactly how many calories and provisions they would need to survive the brutal Colorado winter. When Jedediah returned for the midday meal, he stopped in the doorway, stunned. The cabin was transformed. It smelled of lye soap and baking bread. His trapping gear was neatly oiled and hung on the walls. Over the next 2 weeks, an unspoken rhythm developed between them. Etta used her size to her advantage. When Jedediah struggled to lift a massive roof beam for the new smokehouse, Etta stepped in, planting her thick legs into the dirt, using her substantial weight and leverage to help him hoist it into place. Jedediah had looked at her then, genuine respect in his eyes. But the turning point came on a Tuesday evening. Etta had been sitting on a rickety wooden chair by the fire, mending his heavy winter coat. The chair had been built for a slender man. With a sudden, sharp crack, the wooden legs gave out, and Etta crashed to the floor. Humiliation washed over her like a tidal wave. She sat on the floor, her face burning red, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She was too fat. She was too heavy even for the furniture. She waited for the laughter. Jedediah dropped his carving knife and rushed over. He didn't laugh. He knelt beside her, his large hands gripping her thick arms, pulling her up with effortless strength. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I broke your chair," she sobbed, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm so sorry. I'm too heavy. I'm a monster." Jedediah stopped. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently lifting her chin so she had to look at him. "You listen to me, Etta Boone," he said fiercely. "You are not a monster. You are a strong, capable woman who just hauled her own weight up a mountain and turned this shack into a home. The problem isn't you. The problem is I built a flimsy chair." The next day, Jedediah didn't go out to trap. Instead, he stayed in the yard with his woodworking tools. By nightfall, he brought a new chair into the cabin. It was beautiful, made of thick, polished oak, with reinforced iron joints and a wide, comfortable seat designed specifically to support a heavy frame. He set it by the fire. "Sit," he commanded gently. Etta sat. It held her perfectly. It didn't groan. It didn't creak. For the first time in her life, someone had not demanded she shrink herself to fit the world. Instead, he had built a piece of the world to fit her. She looked up at the rugged mountain man, her heart swelling with an emotion she had never dared to feel. Winter hit Pine Ridge with the fury of a wounded bear. Snow piled 6 feet high against the cabin walls, isolating them from the world. Down in Oak Haven, Mayor Archibald Higgins sat by his roaring fireplace, sipping brandy, fully expecting the spring thaw to reveal the frozen corpses of his fat niece and the stubborn mountain man. But inside the cabin on Pine Ridge, there was warmth and prosperity. Etta had discovered a chaotic stack of papers in Jedediah's trunk, his trading ledgers, with the local Ute tribe and the Denver fur companies. The companies had been swindling him for years, paying him half the market value for his premium pelts. Using her brilliant mind for mathematics, Etta completely overhauled his books. When a brave from the Ute tribe came on snowshoes to trade late in the season, Etta negotiated. The brave was initially taken aback by the massive white woman, but he quickly respected her sharp mind and fair dealing. She didn't try to cheat him like the town merchants did. She traded fairly, securing a massive surplus of dried elk meat and winter medicinal herbs in exchange for Jedediah's excess iron tools. Jedediah watched her work, completely captivated. He found himself admiring the soft curve of her cheek, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, and the sheer, comforting presence of her in his home. He had spent his life surrounded by sharp, jagged rocks and biting winds. Etta was soft, warm, and unshakably solid. He began to touch her more often, a hand on her wide shoulder, brushing a stray lock of hair from her round face. Etta, who had spent her life shrinking away from touch, learned to lean into his massive warmth. They became lovers in the deep quiet of winter, discovering a profound, passionate connection built on mutual respect and unexpected desire. By March, the snow began to melt. Archibald Higgins grew impatient. He sent his brutal enforcer and son, Buford Higgins, up the mountain to check on the homestead. Buford was instructed to find evidence of abandonment or, if they were still alive, to cause an accident that would drive them off. Buford rode up the thawing trail, a cruel smirk on his face. He expected to find a starving, miserable woman and a broken man. Instead, he rode into a thriving compound. The smokehouse was full. The firewood was stacked high, and the cabin looked fortified. Jedediah was down at the creek checking traps. Etta was in the yard, using a heavy iron splitting maul to chop kindling. Despite the winter, she hadn't lost weight. If anything, she looked healthier, her skin glowing, her massive frame moving with practiced, rhythmic power. "Well, well, well," Buford sneered, dismounting his horse. "Looks like the mountain didn't kill the fat pig after all. Uncle Archibald reckoned Boone would have rolled you off a cliff by November." Etta didn't flinch. She rested the heavy maul on the chopping block and turned to face him. She was no longer the terrified girl in the mayor's office. She was Etta Boone, a woman of the mountains. "State your business, Buford, and get off my land," Etta said, her voice echoing with authority. "Your land?" Buford laughed, spitting chewing tobacco into the snow. "This land belongs to my father. He's voiding the deed. Says Boone violated the terms by marrying a woman mentally unfit for homesteading. I'm here to pack your massive ass up and drag you back to town to sign the annulment." Buford took a menacing step forward, reaching for his pistol. He never made it to the leather holster. Etta moved with shocking speed for a woman her size. She reached behind the woodpile and produced Jedediah's Winchester repeating rifle. In one fluid motion, she levered a round into the chamber and leveled the heavy barrel squarely at Buford's chest. "I am the bookkeeper of Pine Ridge," Etta said coldly, her finger resting gently on the trigger. "And you are trespassing. Mount the horse, Buford, or I will bury you under the manure pile where you belong." Buford froze, his eyes widening. He looked at the massive woman, realizing with sudden terror that she wasn't bluffing. Her hands were rock steady. He slowly backed away, raised his hands and scrambled onto his horse. "My father will come with the sheriff," Buford shouted as he wheeled the horse around. "You're done, fatty. Both of you." When Jedediah returned from the creek, he found Etta calmly drinking tea on the porch, the Winchester resting across her wide lap. When she told him what happened, a dark, terrifying rage passed over Jedediah's face. He began gathering his ammunition. "No, Jedediah," Etta said, placing a gentle, heavy hand on his arm. "Let them come. I have been waiting for this." 2 days later, Mayor Archibald Higgins rode into the clearing, accompanied by Sheriff Miller and 4 armed deputies. Archibald looked triumphant. He had the annulment papers and a foreclosure notice ready. Jedediah stood on the porch, his hand resting near his revolver. Etta stood right beside him, an imposing, magnificent figure in her neatly mended dress. "It's over, Boone," Archibald shouted from his horse. "You're in violation of the Homestead Act. This woman is a dependent, not a partner. The marriage is a sham, and the deed is forfeit. Pack your things and get off my mountain." "It is not your mountain, Uncle Archibald." Etta's voice rang out, clear and powerful. She stepped off the porch. Archibald sneered at her immense size. "Shut your mouth, Henrietta. You're coming back to the cellar where you belong." Etta reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, thick red leather ledger book. Archibald's face instantly drained of all color. He recognized that book. He had searched his mansion top to bottom for it for 6 months. "When you locked me in your library for 10 years, Uncle, you forgot that I learned to read numbers," Etta said, holding the book up in the sunlight. "This is your private ledger, the one detailing exactly how much county tax money you embezzled to buy your railroad shares and the bribes you paid to the land commissioners in Denver." The deputies shifted nervously, looking at the mayor. Sheriff Miller frowned. "What's she talking about, Mayor?" "She's lying. She's a fat, crazy spinster," Archibald shrieked, his composure shattering. "Shoot her. Take the book. Shoot my wife, and I'll kill every man here before I hit the dirt," Jedediah roared, drawing his revolver with lightning speed, placing himself directly in front of Etta's massive frame, shielding her with his own body. "I have already sent a copy of specific pages to the federal marshals in Denver with the Ute trading caravan," Etta lied smoothly, her bluff ironclad. "If we are forced off this land, or if any harm comes to my husband, the entire book goes to the territorial governor." "You will hang, Archibald." Archibald stared at the fat niece he had discarded like garbage. He had given her to the mountain man to break her. Instead, the mountain man had given her a fortress, and she had found her teeth. What do you want?" Archibald choked out, defeated. "I want the permanent, uncontestable deed to Pine Ridge registered in both my name and Jedediah's," Etta demanded. "And I want you to resign as mayor of Oakhaven and leave the territory. If you are gone by the end of the month, the ledger burns. If you stay, you hang." Archibald looked at Sheriff Miller, who was now glaring at him suspiciously. The mayor had lost. He yanked his horse's reins violently. "You're monsters, both of you," he spat, before galloping back down the trail, his deputies slowly following behind. The clearing fell silent. The mountain breeze whispered through the pines. Jedediah turned to Etta. He looked at the red ledger in her hand, then up at her flushed, triumphant face. A slow, incredibly rare smile broke through his thick beard. He reached out, wrapping his large arms around her massive waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You didn't really send a copy to Denver, did you?" he whispered, his eyes dancing with amusement. "The Ute caravan doesn't leave until next month," Etta confessed with a wicked little smile, resting her hands on his broad chest. but a good bookkeeper always knows how to leverage an asset. Jedediah laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the peaks. He kissed her, deeply and passionately, right there in the yard. Archibald had meant to destroy them both with this cruel bargain. Instead, he had given the lonely mountain man the greatest treasure of his life, a bride with a brilliant mind, a fierce spirit, and a heart large enough to fill the wild, untamed frontier. What an incredible journey of resilience and unexpected love. Henrietta proved that true worth isn't measured by the cruel standards of others, but by the strength of your spirit and the brilliance of your mind. If this Wild West tale of defying the odds and finding genuine affection warmed your heart, please hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a great twist, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable historical dramas.